In the early morning hours of November 29, 1966, the freighter Daniel J. Morrell was fighting her way through a violent storm on Lake Huron. 2 days earlier, she departed Buffalo, New York, bound for Taconite, Minnesota, where she would pick up one last load of iron ore for the season. But little did her crew know that in just a matter of time, the aging freighter would succumb to that fierce switch of November and become one of the largest shipwrecks in the history of the Great Lakes. Our story begins at the turn of the 20th century, when the United States experienced a massive industrial boom, and the Great Lakes were churning out record amounts of steel. With the growing demand for the raw materials in the region needed to make steel, the Cambria Steamship Company, a division of the Cambria Iron Company, was founded in 1906 to operate ships that could transport iron ore from the mines surrounding Lake Superior down to the steel mills on Lake Erie. The company soon ordered 2 nearly identical freighters. The first one would be built by the Superior Shipbuilding Company in Superior, Wisconsin, while the other would be built by the West Bay Shipbuilding Company in West Bay City, Michigan. The first ship, labeled hull number 515, was launched on August 18, 1906, and she was named the Edward Y. Townsend, after the former president of the Cambria Iron Company. And 4 days later, on August 22nd, her sister ship, labeled hull number 619, was launched. She was named the Daniel J. Morrell, after the former general manager of the Cambria Iron Company, who also served 2 terms in the U.S. House of Representatives from Pennsylvania from 1867 to 1871. He passed away on August 20th, 1885, at the age of 64. Both ships shared the title Queen of the Lakes when they were launched. The Daniel J. Morrell came in at 7,239 gross tons and measured 603 feet or 184 meters in length. Her sister, the Edward Y. Townsend, came in at 7,438 gross tons and measured 602 feet or 183 meters in length. The Morrell was powered by 2 Scotch Marine boilers which fueled a triple expansion steam engine driving a single propeller. Both the Morrell and the Townsend held the title Queen of the Lakes for the next 4 months, being surpassed by the freighter William B. Kerr, which was launched on December 29, 1906. In fact, a total of 6 ships held the title in 1906. Although the Morrell was the largest ship on the lakes at the time, her design still followed the blueprints that built nearly every lake freighter at the time. But still, she and her sister would have long and successful careers. It's now late September 1906, and the Daniel J. Morrell is fully completed and ready for service. She departed the shipyard in Bay City, Michigan on September 24th, bound for Lake Superior, where she would pick up her first load of iron ore. She steamed north through Lake Huron and the St. Mary's River before reaching Sault Ste. Marie. When the ship arrived at the Sioux Lock, she was greeted by huge crowds eager to watch the brand new, largest ship on the Great Lakes pass through on her way to Lake Superior. She then arrived in Taconite Harbor, Minnesota, where she took on her first cargo of iron ore. After departing Taconite Harbor, she set a course for Buffalo, New York, where her cargo was unloaded and was delivered to her owners, the Cambria Iron Company. And this would be her usual route throughout her career. In the first few months of their careers, the Morrell and the Townsend were breaking new records for the most cargo carried by a freighter on the Great Lakes. 2 years later, in 1908, the Cambria Steamship Company chartered the 2 ships to be operated by the M.A. Hanna Company. Afterward, the hulls and funnels of the Morrell and Townsend were repainted black to match the livery of the M.A. Hanna Company. The company operated the 2 ships until 1927, when they were transferred to the Bethlehem Transportation Company, a division of the Bethlehem Steel Corporation, which absorbed the Cambria Iron Company in 1930, and the hulls and funnels of the Morrell and the Townsend were repainted their original colors. Aside from that, the Daniel J. Morrell enjoyed a relatively uneventful career, with a few exceptions. On August 13, 1909, while sailing through a heavy fog bank on Whitefish Bay, she collided with the 600-foot freighter Henry Phipps. Luckily, both ships were repaired and returned to service. In November 1958, while sailing through a storm on Lake Superior, she suffered damage to her hull that required some repairs. Ironically, this was the same storm that took down the SS Carl D. Bradley. In 1959, while she was taking on cargo in Taconite Harbor, Minnesota, the equipment caused slight damage to her hull, and the same thing happened again in 1960. But still, the Daniel J. Morrell had a very productive and successful career. In fact, in 1922, the Sperry Gyroscope Company installed a gyro compass on the Morrell, making her the first ship on the Great Lakes to use a gyro compass. She was then reboilered in 1945, placing her old Scotch boilers with 2 water tube Babcock and Wilcox boilers. She was reboilered once again in 1956 with a 3-cylinder Skinner Uniflow engine, and this nearly doubled her original horsepower. By 1966, the Daniel J. Morrell and her sister were going on 60 years of service, and that year, the Morrell underwent 3 Coast Guard safety inspections, with her final one taking place on July 20th, and she easily passed all 3 of them. Although the ship was showing her age, it seemed to her crew and her owners that she would navigate the Great Lakes well into the future. In late November 1966, the Daniel J. Morrell, under the command of Captain Arthur Crowley, was docked in Taconite Harbor, Minnesota, taking on a load of iron ore. This was to be the Morrell's final voyage of the season, but as fate would have it, while she was loading, Captain Crowley received a call from his company offices in Cleveland. They told him that the Morrell would need to make one more trip carrying iron ore, since one of their freighter's engines had broken down. so they told Crowley that the Morrell had to make one more trip of the season so they could meet their tonnage quotas. Not long after, she departed with her cargo bound for Buffalo, New York. The Morrell entered the St. Clair River at around 11 a.m. on November 25th, and around the same time, she passed by another vessel. On board that vessel was a photographer by the name of Thomas Sikora, who took a photo of the Morrell as she passed by. And then, at around 5 p.m. that same day, while she was steaming down the Detroit River, another photographer named Emery Massman took a photo of the Morrell as she passed by. And these are the last known photos ever taken of the vessel. The Morrell and her sister, the Townsend, arrived in Buffalo that night. However, the freighter had to wait for 2 ships to finish unloading their cargo before the Morrell could unload hers. Since it would likely be a while before the Morrell could start unloading, let alone finish unloading, several crew members decided to leave the ship for some time in order to spend time with family and friends or see some sights. One of those crew members was 26-year-old deck watchman Dennis Hale. Hale joined the crew of the Daniel J. Morrell in the spring of 1964 as a deck watchman. When he joined, he was unsure if the vessel was seaworthy. He even reported that she was full of dirt and cobwebs, and that whenever he went below deck, he always found leaks in her hull. Not to mention, she had been in long-term layup in Erie, Pennsylvania for several years at that point, and the decision had just been made to return her to service. Despite all of this, he grew to love life on the lakes, and even made some good friends on the Morrell. Once he realized that it would be a while before the Morrell could unload, he decided to take a quick trip to Ashtabula, Ohio, where he could spend some time with his family. Along with him was one of his shipmates, John Graw, and on the way, Hale dropped him off at his home in Erie, Pennsylvania. However, the Morrell was unloaded quicker than Hale had originally thought. He arrived in Buffalo on the evening of November 26, just in time to see the Daniel J. Morrell clear the harbor. He and his shipmate, John Graw, who also missed the ship, then went to the Coast Guard station to radio the ship. Luckily, the ship was scheduled to take on a load of coal at the Mullen Dock in Windsor, Ontario the next day. Hale and Graw figured they could join the ship there, so they made the long trip to Ontario where they would board the Daniel J. Morrell for her final run of the season. The Daniel J. Morrell departed Buffalo, New York on the evening of November 26. This was to be her 34th and final voyage of the 1966 season. On this voyage, she had no cargo, and her ballast tanks were filled to keep her steady. She was bound for Taconite Harbor, Minnesota, where she would pick up one last load of iron ore for the season. At 3:10 a.m., around 4 hours later, the Morrell's sister ship, the Townsend, under the command of Captain Thomas Connolly, had finished unloading her cargo in Buffalo and had departed bound for Taconite Harbor as well. As the Morrell made her way across Lake Erie, she encountered choppy seas, gale-force winds, and snow flurries, but it was nothing the massive freighter couldn't handle. However, at around 6 p.m., while she was sailing north through the Detroit River, her crew decided to drop anchor and wait out the storm. Just after 11 p.m., her sister, the Edward Y. Townsend, had passed the Morrell, which was still anchored in the river. The Townsend had also taken a beating in the storm, but she was holding on. After passing her sister ship, Captain Connolly of the Townsend radioed Captain Crowley of the Morrell and told him that he would continue sailing north into the St. Clair River and anchor near Stag Island. And just before 7 a.m. on the morning of November 27th, the Morrell raised anchor and began steaming north toward the Mullen Dock, where she would take on a load of coal. Dennis Hale and John Graw arrived at the Mullen Dock in Windsor, Ontario at 11 a.m. that same morning. However, the Morrell was nowhere to be seen. She wouldn't arrive until 3 a.m. on the morning of November 28th. While docked, she took on a load of 221 tons of coal for her final leg of the voyage. Hale and Graw joined the vessel while she was loading. The Morrell departed the Mullen Dock at 7:30 that same morning and began her trip north into Lake Huron. At 1 a.m. that afternoon, the Morrell passed her sister ship, the Townsend, which had been anchored there since 4 a.m. that morning. The Morrell entered Lake Huron later that afternoon. The southern part of the lake was relatively mild, but as the Morrell steamed north, she faced winds of up to 65 miles per hour, blinding snow, and 20 to 25-foot waves that battered the massive freighter with relentless force. And the weather only continued to get worse over the next several hours, with the Michigan side of Lake Huron being hit with a massive blizzard. The Townsend had raised anchor around the same time, and soon made it into Lake Huron, where she would trail her sister by around 15 miles. Both ships were rolling heavily in the storm, and at 8:30 p.m., Captain Connolly of the Townsend radioed Captain Crowley on the Morrell to discuss the weather, and he told Crowley that he was just passing Harbor Beach, Michigan, near the mouth of Saginaw Bay. He also told Crowley that he would reduce his ship's speed to stabilize her. The two captains radioed each other again at around 10 p.m., both concerned about the safety of their ship. Connolly reported that the Townsend was groaning and creaking with every wave that struck her, putting massive strain on her hull as she rolled violently. The Daniel J. Morrell, still about 15 miles ahead, was experiencing the same conditions. At 11:15 p.m., the two captains once again made radio contact. Although the two ships were weathering the storm, Captain Connolly on the Townsend told Captain Crowley that he would seek shelter in Thunder Bay near Alpena, Michigan, where she would anchor and wait out the storm. While the two captains were talking on the radio, another captain joined the call. It was Captain James Van Buskirk of the freighter Benson Ford, which was sailing downbound through Lake Huron with a cargo of iron ore. The Ford had just left Thunder Bay, and Captain Van Buskirk told the captains of the Morrell and the Townsend that the bay would provide the two ships some shelter from the storm. Captain Van Buskirk soon signed off, and Captain Connolly considered his suggestion, but he decided to hug the shore instead. At 12:15 a.m. on the morning of November 29th, Captain Connolly called Captain Crowley once again. The ships were being punished by gale force winds and towering waves that came in 250 to 300-foot intervals repeatedly crashed over their deck, making it difficult for both ships to stay on course as they rolled and pitched heavily in the maelstrom. At this point, the Morrell was leading the Townsend by about 20 miles, and both captains shared the same concerns. The two skippers then wished each other good luck and signed off, but little did Captain Connolly know, in less than 2 hours, the Daniel J. Morrell and her 29 crew would be in a fight for survival. At 9:30 p.m. on the evening of November 28th, deck watchman Dennis Hale, who had just finished his shift 90 minutes earlier, returned to his cabin for the night. His cabin was located in the bow section of the Daniel J. Morrell on the starboard side. He crawled into his bed and began reading Carl Sandburg's Lincoln, which his sister Jean had recommended to him for this trip. At 10 p.m., he turned off his light and began to fall asleep. His next shift would start at 4 a.m. the following morning. The Morrell's pitching and rolling in the waves didn't bother him, as he was used to the movements of ships in rough seas, and he had no idea of what he was going to experience in just a few hours. At around 2 a.m. on the morning of November 29th, Dennis Hale was awakened by a loud bang from somewhere in the ship. At first, he thought it was the anchor hitting the side of the ship, but then, as he was beginning to fall back asleep, he heard another bang, much louder than the first one, and his books began to fall off the shelf above his bed. He then tried to turn on the lights in his cabin, but they didn't come on. He sat on his bed for a few moments before the ship's general alarm began sounding. Wearing only his boxer shorts and a life jacket, Hale went up to the spar deck to see what was going on. When he reached the spar deck, he came across another crew member, Al Womey. He shouted, "Oh my God." Hale looked toward the aft end of the ship. The lights in the forward section of the ship were out, but he could see the lights of the stern in the darkness. He saw that the Morrell was hogging in the middle, with the stern lifting and falling of the waves, separate from the bow. At this point, it became clear to Hale as to what happened. The Daniel J. Morrell had broken in two. The break was located between the 11th and 12th hatch. Hale then raced back to his cabin to find more clothes. On his way, he ran into watchman Norman Bragg. 13 years earlier, Bragg had survived the sinking of the SS Henry Steinbrenner on Lake Superior, and he gave Hale and a few other crew members some tips on how to survive. Hale soon reached his cabin. He searched for more clothes, but all he could find in the darkness was a wool peacoat. The temperature outside was 33 degrees Fahrenheit, and he knew that without more protection, he could suffer from hypothermia. He also had no shoes on, and the decks were covered in a thick layer of ice and slush. With the ship breaking up from underneath him, Hale and a few of his shipmates went to one of the inflatable pontoon life rafts which was stored in the bow of the ship. The rafts were designed to float off the ship when she sank, so Hale and a few other crew members sat in the boat while waiting for the ship to submerge beneath them. The group was soon joined by Captain Crowley, first mate Philip Caput, and second mate Duncan MacLeod. Captain Crowley told them that since the ship lost power, they couldn't send a distress signal, meaning no one knew that their ship was in trouble, but they hoped that the Townsend or some other nearby ship would find them. The life raft had a small storage locker which contained a flare gun, as well as other emergency equipment, but the captain told the men waiting on the life raft to not open the locker until they ended up in the water. Despite the severity of the situation, everyone on board remained calm. Meanwhile, the crack in the ship's hull continued to get bigger, and the two sections of the ship grinding together caused a huge shower of sparks that rained down on the deck. And then, Hale and his shipmates experienced what would be every sailor's nightmare. From the already huge crack in her hull, a huge blast of steam was released from the opening in the crack, and the force generated from the blast caused the two sections of the massive ship to completely separate. And now, both the bow and the stern were moving completely separate from each other. However, the boilers in the ship's stern were still intact, and the stern began to steam forward on its own. Hale described the scene as looking like a horrible monster being unleashed. The stern, still moving on its own, began to scrape along the port side of the bow section, which is where much of the crew were. The lights in the stern were still on, and the crew in the bow were able to see the massive open cargo holds in the stern as it steamed past. Just then, a massive wave crashed over the bow and threw the raft and everyone in it into the churning seas. It had only been 8 minutes since the Morrell began breaking up, and now the crew was faced with an enormous challenge. Hale was dragged deep into the frigid waters, but he saw the air bubbles rising and followed them until he finally reached the surface. Once he made it to the surface, he spotted the carbide light from the raft about 30 to 40 feet away from him. After fighting through the massive waves and troughs, he finally made it to the life raft and climbed aboard. There were already 2 other men on the raft when Hale made it on board, deckhands Art Stojak and John Cleary Jr. Shortly thereafter, they were joined by another crew member, wheelsman Charles Fossbender, who was on duty at the time of the breakup. The raft lifted and fell in the 25-foot waves, and the 65-mile-per-hour winds put all 4 men in a state of shock. They hoped that the Townsend or some other nearby ship would find them, but at this point they were alone in the vast waters of Lake Huron, and since the ship never sent out a distress signal, no one had any idea that they were in trouble. That night, it was clear that the weather forecast had severely underestimated the force of the storm, as the Morrell and the Townsend were not the only ships on Lake Huron caught off guard. At 1:45 a.m., just before the Morrell broke up, the 592-foot freighter Kinsman Independent was sailing north through Lake Huron with a cargo of coal. She was passing Harper Beach, Michigan when she ran into trouble. The ship's captain, Zerny Newmerman, was desperately trying to keep his ship on course. It was then that the 65-mile-per-hour winds were causing the ship to spin, blowing her far off course. She then fell into a massive trough where she couldn't get out. The ship became stuck in that trough for 4 minutes. It seemed that the ship would capsize. But then Captain Newman reversed the course of his ship, and the Kinsman Independent was finally able to break out of the trough and resume her voyage. Around the same time, several other ships were fighting similar battles. 450-foot Canadian freighter Howard L. Shaw was also sailing north through Lake Huron when she experienced a similar situation. Captain L.D. Jones of the Shaw reported that the winds were so powerful that the ship's wheels spun out of control, making it impossible for her to maneuver herself. The winds then caused the ship to veer 180 degrees off course. So instead of sailing north like she was supposed to, she was now sailing south. Captain Jones said it was as if his ship was being spun around like a top. Though fortunately, the Shaw, despite being 6 years older than the Daniel J. Morrell, managed to survive the storm as well. Then, just before 2:30 a.m., the 586-foot freighter Robert Hobson was sailing north only a few miles behind the Morrell, carrying a cargo of coal. Captain Charles Finch of the Hobson remarked that the conditions were, quote, "the worst continuously heavy seas I've ever been in." Shortly thereafter, Captain Finch decided to turn his ship around, knowing that it wasn't safe to continue sailing north, and the Hobson soon joined several other ships that were racing to the shelter of the St. Clair River. Around the same time, the 615-foot Harry Colby was struck by a massive wave which crashed over her bow. Her captain also decided the conditions were too much for his freighter. Then, the 504-foot Fred A. Mansk was also faced with a challenging situation. She had just turned south to take shelter from the storm, and she was rolling heavily in the monstrous waves. The Mansk was a self-unloader, and her captain feared that her heavy cargo boom would cause the ship to capsize if she rolled too far. Though fortunately, the ship made it through the storm unscathed. The captains of these ships, including Captain Connolly at the Townsend, reported that it was the worst storm that they'd ever been in. However, what these ships experienced is nothing compared to what happened to the German freighter Nordmeer. 10 days earlier, the 470-foot Nordmeer was carrying a load of rolled steel from Hamburg, Germany, bound for Chicago. The weather that day was calm, but that night, she suddenly ran aground on Thunder Bay Shoal, located about 12 miles east of Alpena, Michigan. The grounding caused all 5 of the ship's cargo holds, including her engine room, to flood, and she quickly sank in the shallow waters. Her captain and 7 crew members decided to stay on board to supervise any salvage operations that would take place on the vessel. But then, after sitting on that shoal for a week, the storm hit. The ship was being ripped apart by the unrelenting waves and gale-force winds for days on end. Finally, at 3 a.m. on the morning of November 29th, Captain Ernst George Steinbeck of the Nordmeer radioed the Coast Guard. Nearby was the U.S. Coast Guard vessel Acacia, which was also only about 20 miles or so from the Morrell when she sank, and the ship's captain remarked that if the Morrell had sent out a distress call, they would have likely been able to respond. But instead of the Morrell, the Acacia had received a distress call from the Nordmeer, and Captain Charles Milrat ordered the vessel to head in the direction of the wounded vessel. However, Captain Steinbeck of the Nordmeer had no idea if his distress call was received or not, so he and his crew fired some distress flares into the sky. The Acacia continued sailing in the direction of the German freighter, but Captain Milrat soon realized that the weather conditions would make it impossible for them to conduct a rescue. He changed course and turned south for Port Huron. The crew on the Nordmeer were anxiously waiting for rescue in the ship's pilot house, and even by the afternoon of November 29th, the storm was still raging, slowly tearing the vessel apart. But then, late that afternoon, the storm had lulled. The snow let up, and the winds subsided. Realizing that this was likely their only chance to rescue the men on the Nordmeer, the Coast Guard sent a helicopter to rescue the 8 men on the stranded ship. The break in the storm only lasted about a half an hour, but in that time, the Coast Guard was able to lift all 8 men on the Nordmeer off the ship and onto the Coast Guard icebreaker Mackinac. After facing one of the worst storms they'd ever been in, the crew of the Nordmeer miraculously survived. Now, the wreck of the Nordmeer has disappeared beneath the surface of Lake Huron, and is now only accessible to divers. But other sailors on Lake Huron that day were not so lucky. Not far from where the Nordmeer went down, 4 men were anxiously waiting for rescue on a life raft. It's 2:30 a.m., November 29th, 1966. It has been roughly 20 minutes since the ill-fated ore carrier Daniel J. Morrell broke in two and sent her 29 men into the frigid waters of Lake Huron. 4 of her crew were waiting for rescue on a life raft, and only one of them would make it out alive, and one of them was Deck Watchman Dennis Hale. No distress call had been sent out from the Morrell, so the 4 men struggling in the raft searched for anything they could use to signal their location. One of the men, wheelsman Charles Fossbender, found a flashlight in the raft storage compartment, and began waving it around to signal some lights he saw in the distance. The other 3 men soon saw the lights as well, and they were filled with a sense of relief, but they quickly realized that they were actually looking at the lights of the stern section of the Daniel J. Morrell, which was still moving on its own, completely separated from the bow. It steamed off into the distance, and would travel for the next 90 minutes or so, before it finally sank 5 miles away from where the bow sank. The 4 men on the raft now believed that they were the only crew members to have made it off the Morrell alive. The raft was battered by the 25-foot waves and gale force wind, and the four men soon made some small talk about making out alive. Deckhand John Cleary soon asked Dennis Hale what their chances of survival were, to which Hale replied, quote, "A lot better than the guys who didn't make it out with us," unquote. They soon discussed how they would be able to stay warm and make it out. Hale soon felt his whole body go numb, and he later remarked, quote, "I suffered so much from the cold I was almost hoping to die," unquote. Hale then put his hands in his mouth to keep them warm, and he did his best to keep himself awake, as he knew that sleep would cause him to lose his life. By 7:30 a.m. that morning, the other two men on the raft, Art Stojak and John Cleary, all of them were now dead, and now it was just Hale and Charles Fossbender. Around the same time, the storm had weakened considerably, but the waves continued to rock the small life raft. By 2 p.m., Hale and Fossbender realized that they had been on the raft for 12 hours, but it appeared to Hale that Fossbender was holding on by a thread. During the sinking, his chest had been crushed and his shoulders were broken. By late afternoon, Fossbender had developed a terrible cough from his crushed chest, and each cough was more painful than the last. Fossbender soon told Hale that it felt like his lungs were blocked off, and Hale suggested that he try to cough it out. However, nothing happened. At 4 p.m., 14 hours after getting on the raft, it was clear to Hale that Fossbender was losing consciousness. He let out one more cough before his body finally gave out. Charles Fossbender was now dead, and Dennis Hale was alone in the vast waters of Lake Huron. Hale continued to drift in and out of consciousness, and at times he had hallucinations of seagulls attacking him on the raft. He feared that he wouldn't make it out alive, but little did he know, rescue was on the way. At 9 a.m. on the morning of November 29, 1966, it had been almost 9 hours since anyone heard from the Daniel J. Morrell. At the Bethlehem Transportation Company's headquarters in Cleveland, Chief Dispatcher Art Dobson was waiting for the report from the Daniel J. Morrell. 9 a.m. was the time that the captains on the lakes were required to report their location and condition. Dobson soon received the report from the Edward Y. Townsend, but never received the one from the Morrell. However, since the vessel didn't send out a distress call, no one thought that the ship was in trouble. Many believed that her radio equipment simply failed in the storm, or she was blown off course by the wind. Morning came and went, and still no one heard anything from the Daniel J. Morrell. It was at this point that some were getting to believe that the worst had happened to the freighter, and she was lost in the storm. At 2 p.m. that afternoon, Captain Connolly of the Townsend reported that they last made radio contact with the Morrell at 12:15 a.m. And at that point, the Morrell was about 15 miles north of the Townsend. Dobson then contacted another Bethlehem freighter, the Arthur B. Homer, sister ship of the ill-fated SS Edmund Fitzgerald, which would tragically sink on Lake Superior just 9 years later. The Homer was supposed to pass by the Morrell at around the same time that Dobson radioed her, and he asked the Homer's captain to keep an eye out for her. He scanned the horizon, but there was no sign of the Morrell. The Homer's captain then tried to radio the Morrell, but he received no response. The hours continued to pass, and Art Dobson was now increasingly concerned about the Morrell. He once again tried to contact Captain Crowley of the freighter, but once again, no response. Dobson contacted a few other ships on Lake Huron, asking if they had seen or heard from the Morrell. Nothing. He still continued to ask the Townsend and the Homer to keep an eye out. Both ships also tuned into Channel 51, which was the frequency reserved for distress calls on the Great Lakes. Then, at 8 p.m. that evening, it had been 18 hours since anyone heard from the Daniel J. Morrell. At this point, Art Dobson had no choice but to believe that the aging freighter was lost on Lake Huron. Once again, at 9 a.m. on the morning of November 30th, the Morrell failed to report. Then, around noon, everyone's suspicions were confirmed, when the freighter CG Post found something shocking 8 miles east of Harbor Beach, Michigan. It was a body, and it was wearing a life jacket with the words Daniel J. Morrell on it. And at 12:15 p.m., 36 hours after she was last heard from, and 34 hours after the ship broke in two, the Morrell was declared missing. Fortunately, the Morrell's sister ship, the Edward Y. Townsend, survived the storm, though she didn't make it unscathed. She soon arrived in the St. Mary's River, where she would continue her route north to Taconite Harbor, Minnesota. She soon stopped at Lime Island to take on additional fuel. While she was fueling, Captain Connolly inspected his ship for any damage. While below deck, he found some popped rivets. This wasn't unusual for a ship sailing through a storm. However, while he was on the spar deck, he found a 2-foot crack in her number 10 hatch cover. This crack allowed nearly 4 feet of water to pour into her cargo holds during the storm. The damage wasn't too concerning, but Connolly feared that the Morrell might have suffered similar but more severe damage to her hull during the storm. Connolly reported the damage to the ship's owners, and the Townsend continued sailing north, before mooring at the Carbide Dock in Sault Ste. Marie. Little did her crew know, this would be the last time the Townsend would ever sail again. At 4 p.m. on November 30th, Dennis Hale had been on the raft for 38 hours. By then, the raft had drifted only a few hundred feet from the shore, but he didn't have the strength to move, and he feared that he wouldn't be able to survive another night. However, he soon heard a noise above him. A Coast Guard helicopter hovered over him, and 2 of its crew reached for his raft, and lifted him into the helicopter, where he was then taken to the nearest hospital. Hale had spent 38 hours on the raft, and his raft traveled 19 miles from where the Morrell broke up, all the way to the shore near Point-à-Barques, Michigan. He remained in the hospital for some time, but in the end, he survived. he would never sail again, and he soon returned home to his family in Ohio, and for many years he refused to tell the story of the Daniel J. Morrell. In the months following the Morrell disaster, families of the victims were outraged that the ship's owners continued to operate the ship despite her extreme age. They were curious of her seaworthiness and why she was still sailing that late in the season. After all, her loss was fairly similar to the sinking of the Carl D. Bradley 8 years earlier. On December 5th, 6 days after the disaster, the U.S. Coast Guard Marine Board began an investigation into the sinking, which lasted until March of 1967. Bethlehem Transportation Corporation, which owned and operated the Daniel J. Morrell, eventually got sued by the families of the ship's victims, desperately trying to uncover the truth about the aging vessel. Soon, many came to testify about the safety of the Morrell. One of the first to testify was Len Harriville, the fleet engineer for the Bethlehem Transportation Company. He said that there wasn't anything wrong with the Morrell, as the ship passed all 3 Coast Guard inspections that she had in the 1966 season. However, he also pointed out that the Morrell didn't have any emergency backup system for her radio if the ship lost power, meaning that since the ship's power failed when she started sinking, she had no way to send an SOS. Then, Captain William Hull, who was the captain of the Morrell before being replaced by Captain Crowley in August 1966, also came to testify. He reported that in November of 1958, while he was the second mate of the Morrell, the ship was sailing through a storm on Lake Superior with 100-mile-per-hour winds and 25-foot waves. The Morrell made it through that storm unscathed, but that same storm sank the younger Carl D. Bradley on Lake Michigan. Thomas Burns, who was the Morrell's third mate at the time and who also retired in August 1966, also reported that the Morrell was in good shape when he left the ship. But then Captain Connolly of the Morrell's sister, the Edward Y. Townsend, testified that the weather forecast had severely underestimated the force of that storm, and said that it was the worst storm he'd ever seen in his 27 years in the lakes. Some of the captains who were on Lake Huron that night also testified that the storm was much worse than originally forecasted. On December 23rd, while he was still in the hospital recovering from his injuries, Dennis Hale testified that when he joined the crew of the Morrell in 1964, he found countless loose rivets below deck, and many of them were leaking. He reported that more than 1,000 rivets needed to be replaced. However, his testimony was soon refuted by officials from the ship's owners, inspectors, and former Captain William Hull, saying that the ship did not have that many rivets that needed to be replaced, but Captain Hull admitted that the ship did have some rivets that needed to be replaced. But Hill was adamant that the ship was not seaworthy, and he even went as far as saying that the Morrell was leaking like a sieve, and as the months passed, more and more people gave their thoughts on what happened. At the same time that the investigations were underway, the Edward Y. Townsend, which was still docked in Sault Ste. Marie, underwent a heavy weather inspection from the U.S. Coast Guard. Captain Connolly told the inspectors that he found a 2-foot crack in the Townsend's hull after she made it through the storm. Because of this, the Townsend did not pass the inspection, and she was towed to a dry dock for a more thorough inspection. It was during this inspection that countless fractures were found throughout the Townsend's hull. The damage was so extensive that she was stripped of her sailing papers. She remained in layup for the next 2 years before being sold for scrap in September of 1968. On September 15th, she began her tow from Port Colborne, Ontario, bound for a scrapyard located in Spain. She passed Quebec on October 1st and soon entered the Atlantic Ocean. But on October 7th, disaster struck, when the fleet encountered a massive storm. The unmanned freighter broke free from her tugs and split apart in a similar way as the Morrell, before she disappeared below the surface. She sank roughly 400 miles off the coast of Newfoundland. As of the making of this video, her wreck hasn't been located, but she foundered not too far from where the Titanic sank, though fortunately there were no casualties when the ship went down. The investigations into the loss of the Daniel J. Morrell continued on for the next year and a half, and on April 1st, 1967, the National Transportation Safety Board, or NTSB, was created by the United States government. And from then on, it would be responsible for determining the cause of every transportation-related accidents throughout the country. On February 8, 1968, the NTSB issued its own report on the loss of the Daniel J. Morrell, supporting the Coast Guard's claim that the ship broke apart because of brittle steel used in her construction. Although he didn't survive the sinking, Captain Crowley of the Morrell was cleared of any wrongdoing by the NTSB. The case was soon closed, and recommendations were issued to Great Lakes shipping companies, such as having survival suits on board, as well as other emergency equipment. But even still, after the disaster, Great Lakes shipping companies still prioritized profits over safety when it came to the operation of lake freighters, and the Daniel J. Morrell would not be the last shipwreck on the Great Lakes. Just 9 years after her fateful end, another lake freighter, larger and more advanced than the Morrell, would succumb to another fierce November witch, and take all of her crew down with her. That ship would be the infamous Edmund Fitzgerald. In mid-December 1966, the Bethlehem Steel Corporation hired a Canadian diving company named McQueen Marine to locate the wreck of the Daniel J. Morrell. However, bad weather prevented them from searching. Then, on January 6, 1967, a Navy aircraft was flying over the lake when it detected a magnetic anomaly 16 miles north of Point-aux-Barques, Michigan. believing that they found the wreck of the Daniel J. Morrell. The Coast Guard hired Ocean Systems, based in Alexandria, Michigan, to scan the wreck. Ocean Systems chartered the U.S. Coast Guard cutter Bramble to head out and take photos of the wreck and prove it was what they were looking for. After an extensive scan of the wreck, it was confirmed to be the stern section of the Daniel J. Morrell. The stern stays upright on the bottom in 215 feet of water. Although the stern had been found only weeks after the ship went down, the whereabouts of the bow section would be unknown for more than a decade. But then, in May of 1979, shipwreck hunters David Trotter and Larry Copland found a large anomaly on the bottom of Lake Huron using side-scan sonar. The wreck was found several miles north of where the stern had gone down, and it was quickly confirmed that it was the bow section of the Daniel J. Morrell. The bow sits upright on the bottom in roughly 200 feet of water, 5 miles north of where the stern had gone down, and it was found that she broke apart in the exact spot where Dennis Hill had described it. Interesting, when divers went down to explore both sections of the wreck, they found that the clocks on the bow had stopped at 1:55, while the clock on the stern had stopped at 3:28, meaning that the stern would have been sailing on its own for approximately 90 minutes after the bow sank, before she finally submerged as well. And with both discoveries, the families of the men lost on the Daniel J. Morrell could finally get some closure. But for many years after the disaster, the ship's sole survivor, Dennis Hale, refused to share his experience of what happened that night. But after consulting with a therapist who suggested that he share his story, Hale did everything he could to make sure that the story of the Daniel J. Morrell is never forgotten. He wrote 2 books about his experience, and he frequently spoke publicly about the disaster. He passed away from cancer on September 2, 2015, at the age of 75. To this day, the story of the Daniel J. Morrell is mostly forgotten, but she still lives in the memory of many Great Lakes sailors and relatives of those lost during that fierce November witch. Thank you so much for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss any new uploads from this channel. And if you find the story of the Daniel J. Morrell fascinating, I highly recommend the books 1 and 2, The Sinking of the Daniel J. Morrell and One Man's Survival on the Open Sea by Michael Schumacher, and Deadly Voyage, The SS Daniel J. Morrell Tragedy by Andrew Cantor. Both were extremely helpful in the making of this documentary. You can find the links to both of them in the description below. Anyways, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.